In August 2020, when the world was still grappling with the COVID-19 lockdowns, 220 men met up at night in a secluded field in Germany to fight. There is only an 18-second video of the clash between the hooligan firms of Eintracht Frankfurt and SV Darmstadt. The shaky footage shows two huge lines of fighters, one side dressed in red t-shirts, the other white, slowly walking towards each other before the scene degenerates into a vicious brawl. But we know what happened next because someone always counts the fighters, times the bout, keeps the rules, and keeps the score. 100 versus 120, 2 minutes 30 seconds, Frankfurt win. Welcome to football's secret fight club. Football has long been associated with hooliganism, but since leaving the stadiums, hooliganism has morphed into something different, more organised, more violent, and much more secretive. Football banning orders and tough policing means that rival hooligans find it almost impossible to meet at the match. Instead, they arrange fights far away from prying eyes with their own rules and moral code. The numbers of fighters must be the same. Under no circumstances are weapons allowed, you must stop beating your opponent if you knock them unconscious, and the winner is the last team standing. Thousands of men take part every weekend across Europe. Its roots can be found in Eastern Germany, but the sport has spread throughout Europe and become wildly popular in Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, France, and beyond. In Dutch, it's known as bosfights, or forest fights. Sometimes it's referred to as free fights, or field fights. In Poland, it's called ustawka, which is a rather polite word which means to have a pre-arranged meeting. In Russian, okolo futbola, which means around football. Every weekend, thousands of young men, and it is almost exclusively young men, crisscross Europe to clash with rivals. They can take place anywhere, a deserted forest or a farmer's field. And you won't find footage of it online, or at least not easily. The fights are arranged on encrypted messaging apps, anonymity is brutally protected, and anyone who posts unredacted footage of fights can find themselves permanently ostracized at the very least. Also, hooligan firms shouldn't be mistaken for ultras, who prepare the choreography on match days. A firm is the trained wing of a football club's supporters, and they look very different to the beer-bellied hooligans of the past. Many train with military dedication, 6 days a week to stay in shape, training to hone their fighting skills, and they don't drink or do drugs. Ultra groups and hooligan firms are governed by an informal network of friendships and enemies, usually with clubs that share the same political or social values. Arranged fights are the same, with firms that share a friendship joining forces. The fight in Frankfurt with 220 people was actually a sort of confederation of firms. Eintracht Frankfurt hooligans versus the combined forces of SV Darmstadt plus firms from Bern, Berlin, Bremen, Minsk, and the famously left-wing club from Hamburg, St. Pauli. And the hooligans argue that they aren't doing anything wrong. They're taking violence out of the stadium, regulating it, and moving it far away from innocent people. Although activists have long highlighted the connections between firms and far-right groups and activities, even though there are some firms from traditionally left-wing fan bases too. As Robert Claus, the author of Hooliganism, A World Between Football, Violence and Politics, told Deutsche Welle, hooliganism has developed from poorly organised street fights to an international network of martial arts and businesses. For years, the authorities have ignored the professionalism of hooliganism, which was also pushed by far-right elements. And unsurprisingly, the new look firms are not immune from the interests of the police. One case in Belgium highlighted the risks involved. In 2021, 66 Royal Antwerp hooligans were convicted for arranging free fights. Lawyers for the defendants argued that free fights were a form of personal freedom and compared the desire to arrange fights with sadomasochism. But the judge didn't see it that way. Some of the hooligans were sentenced to 2 years in prison. But there can also be unintended consequences for having thousands of highly trained men who are battle-ready. Back in 2014, when the Maidan Revolution took place in Ukraine, thousands of ultras and hooligans joined the fray and backed the protesters who demanded the resignation of pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych. Despite most being on the far right, the ultras and hooligans shared a common enemy with the mostly liberal pro-European protesters. And it was their skills fighting the police and each other that helped to push back on the violence being meted out to the protesters. To this day in Ukraine, they are seen as an important street fighting contingency that played an important role in removing Viktor Yanukovych. In fact, when Russia invaded and illegally annexed Crimea, a new citizen militia emerged that would go on to play a pivotal role in the ongoing war. The Azov Battalion was headed up by Andriy Beletsky, a far-right activist and politician from Kharkov. With the Ukrainian military in poor shape and unable to stop the Russian army, it fell to groups like Azov to counter, which they did by preventing the now destroyed city of Mariupol from falling into Russian hands. And one reason for its success is that the vast majority of fighters were already highly trained and disciplined ultras and hooligans, who'd cut their teeth in the arranged fighting scene. Beletsky said that 65% of Azov's fighters had come from the Tifo Football scene. Of course, Russia again invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. Azov, now known as the Azov Guard, had been incorporated into Ukraine's military structure and became famous for their last-man defense of the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol. And many of the best hooligans and ultras are now on the front lines. In fact, fighters from football firms all across Europe have travelled to Ukraine to join the fight. And the Russian side also has a separate ultra and hooligan battalion, Española, which is 550 men strong and includes fighters from Cheska, Zenit, Spartak, Torpedo and Lokomotiv. But whilst the war in Ukraine rumbles on, the fighting in Europe continues. A weekend sport, with their outcomes reported on like football scores on Telegram channels like Hooligans CZ and Grupa OF, even during the summer break. So while the football might stop, the fighting never does. If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.